Hello, class. I'm going here. I'll be going over a recording of all the material I covered in section today for those who couldn't make it, or anyone who just wants to rewatch everything. So this is going to be a more condensed version, as always, just because, of course, you can't ask questions, and I'll just be going over everything at a much faster pace because of that. And I'm just assuming that you guys know most of this and you're using it as more of a tool to study, or maybe further some of your knowledge, or maybe double check something. So I'm going to first say, by all the midterms should be graded. If your midterm is not graded, please email me. And I'll quickly correct that. But I think I double checked. Everyone did really well, so I'm happy to say that. Now we'll get on to the section. So there are 5 questions. Uh, 1 and 3 are the same, just slightly different, and then 2 or 4 are the same. So the first question is, we're going to read in our height data set, which is a .txt, and we know it has an ID, height, and a unit, which will be either a centimeter or inches. And then we're going to use that to create all of our centimeters over to inches. And then we're going to drop the unit variable, because at that point, since everything is in inches, we don't really need anything to be in centimeters. And then from here, we're going to use our group file, because now we want to know each of these members are in either a group A or a group B. I'm going to use our proc means to see our observations, the mean, and the variance. I know it's the standard deviation, but I'm going to go over variance just because we all know standard deviation is just there's a couple ways to do it in the proc means, but we've all seen it as one way to do it as STD or stand dev, or 2 different ways to do it. So we know how to do that. And then 3, we're going to redo question 1 just with a new data called height2.txt. This has the same variables, but some are missing. And from this, we're going to have to transform everything from centimeters to inches again. And then at that point, we need to drop the unit variable, because we already know everything in inches. In the data sets that don't have the units, we don't really know what their height is, because maybe they have a height in centimeters that looks like it's in inches, or vice versa. So we're going to have to figure out what we'll do with that. And then number 4, we're going to pretty much repeat question 2 again, this with group 2, and then we're going to merge the 2 together. And then we're going to figure out the observations, the mean, and the variance of the height for these groups and see what they are. And then question 5 is, we want to modify the 2, and then we're going to group them together. And then when we want to use a frequency to figure out proc freq, just to create a cross table. And we're also going to identify which one is which. So this part here, include a variable source, which indicates the data, which one it is from. So we'll have the first 2 questions be source 1, and the next 2 questions be source 2. So now I'm going to go over to the code. I already have it all in. So starting at the beginning, I have data height. We have an in file and an input. And as remember, once we use our in file, we have to use our input line, which is different than if we used libname. And that's just because this way we are still reading it in. And one of the advantages of using in file, just say right here, I just have this line right here. It's not in a folder like our class data sets. So if I put this class data sets all in a libname, I can access any of these. But if I used a class data set for this, I would only be able to access the height. So using in file here is just as good. And we know that ID characteristic, height numeric, so no $, and units is characteristic. We will run just to make sure this works. And we see here we're good. Now the proc contents, I'll let you guys look into that, but it's pretty much the same thing. Make sure it's the sorter, the type of characters, and all of those things we've gone over in the previous sections. So here we have our ID, frequency percent, and cumulative percent. So these are our 4 things that the proc freq feature prints out. And of course, we have our observations, which is the ID as our first part. We know each one should only have 1 observation, which it does, which is good. And then we're going to go to height. So we see by height, what is our frequency percent and cumulative percent. And we see that there are a big jump between the two. And then down here, we see our units. So we have centimeters, centimeters, inches, inches, centimeters, inches. So we see that there are only one way they spell centimeters, which is nice, but they use upper and lower case, and that there's 9 total observations that have centimeters, 3 with cm, both capital, 3 with C capital, lowercase m, and then 3 with both lowercase. So when we're transforming our centimeters, we have to take that into consideration. So here we do, we're going to make the height all in inches. So we're going to use our set from the height, which is taking this data up here into our data set. And if it is a lowercase version, is equal to cm. So that means all of our units are lowercase. Then we will do height is equal to height divided by 2.54, which is the transformation needed to get it into inches. And then we end with an n. This is because we had a then do. So we could put more information in right here. So we could have units equals inches if we wanted. And that will only change all the centimeters down to inches. This was a characteristic, so it should be in, of course, we should put it into parentheses. But we're going to drop the units so it's not necessary. And we'll run this just to show you guys what it looks like. And there you go, we just have our height and our ID, and we can see which ones were the centimeters just based on the amount of decimal places, just because dividing by 2.54 doesn't work out perfectly usually. And now we have a group, which is just our ID in our group, both characteristic, as we can see here, and we have 40 observations, which is the same as the other. Now we want to merge these together. So if we're merging stuff together, we know we have to use our proc sort, just so everything is sorted the same way. And look up here just to make sure we have both of them sorted. We go table, height, and group, so we are good there. We have our proc contents and our proc brief. Well, with proc contents for both. I'll let you guys do that, of course, again. And then here we have our merge. So we know that each one of the observations, we knew just based on creation that all the IDs had a height ID in group and in height that matched. So we sorted the by IDs and then merged by IDs. So each corresponding group was correlated to its height. So we knew that again. Now we want to do a proc means. And since I'm doing output out, I will need to have a proc print at the end. Sorry about that. So here I'm looking at our height by group. So I'm looking at each group's height. So I'm looking at from their height, I'll look at the amount of people in each group, the mean of each group, and the variance of each group. So we're going to run this. And here we see. So this blank right here is the overall. So we see that our overall, we have 40 people with an average of about 67.5 and a variance of 18. And from group A, we have 16 people with height of 68. And in group B, we have 24 with a height of 67. So we see that group A is on average about 1 inch taller than group B. And the average is about 67.5, which is in the middle, which is good to see because that means we have done everything right, because as always, it should be in the middle. So here we're going to do the same thing again, but we're adding miss over when we're reading it in, just so some of our variables are missing, as it said in the question. Oop, I did not get everything there, so I need to run the entire thing. And here we go. We see some of our units are missing, so we'll have to take that into consideration. And the proc freaks and the proc contents will do the same thing. But on this proc freak, we've added a table for units and height, so I'll be running this just to show you the difference. So instead of showing every single one as we did above, we just have the different ways they inputted centimeters and inches here, instead of just all of the ID numbers also. So we see there's only 4 ways here, which is different than the other. And here are all the different heights we have. And it also tells us the frequency of our missing values at the bottom. So we have 3 values with the missing units, which is good to know because we need to use that later on. Now here we're going to read this in and change it to inches. So we have taking our set for height 2, which is just using the data set we just read in. And if if uppercase centimeters, so now since we used uppercase, both our letters have to be C capital M. And then our height is equal to times 3.094, which is the same thing as dividing by 2.54, just another way to do it. And then if uppercase units is equal to IN, then height is just equal to height. Else, height is equal to a dot. And this is because we know that we don't really know what unit it is, so we're just going to put it as a dot just so we don't make a mistake. And we want to make sure our observations are exactly how they should be, because there was an incomplete data set we cannot take into consideration. So we will run this, and we want to say that if it is truly a dot, and if the inches and centimeters all look the same. So we still have our 25 observations we saw before, and our 3 observations that we had that we saw in our Proc Freak of missing the units are now decimal places. And other than that, all of our heights are in a close enough range that they all look good. So none of them were most likely in centimeters. So now we still have our group 2 data, which is still just the ID and our group, which is just A and B still, as you guys can see. And then we will sort the 2 to merge them together. But as we know, some of our values in height 2 do not have all complete values, right? So we want to make sure we only include complete records. So the people who do not have a height, we need to remove from the data set. So we're going to use our in equals A. We could also have an in equals B here, just for completion if we wanted to. But we wouldn't put it down here just because we know all of group 2 is accounted for. And our A has stuff that has missing values. So we merge by our D because that's what we sorted by right here. And I'll just run it again just in case. In here, we should just have all of our observations. We are good. So we're good there. Now we want to group them together. And here we go. That means we should have our 25 from group our height 2 data set, and then our 40 from our height 1. And we see that with 65 when we add them together. So it's good. We have all of our data here. And then we're going to take our proc means. Now remember, beforehand our mean was 68 for group A, and now it is 67.67. But our group B is still about 67 inches. So the difference between the two has shrunk. And now it's about 0.6 difference instead of about 1 inch difference, which is still big. And we see that the main difference between the min and the max is that the minimum for group B is about 4 inches shorter than the minimum for group A, while the maximum are about the same. So now we want to add the identifier. So I'm going to sort all 4 of our data by their ID again, and just to make sure they're all sorted in the right way. Then I'm going to re-merge everything. Right here, we're relocating our group height data by merging our height and our group by our IDs. And then we're adding our source, like we said we want to add our identifier. And we're setting this to 1, as we talked about at the beginning of the recording. We'll run this, and we'll see that now it has 3 columns that are our explanatory besides ID. So we have our ID, and then our 3 columns that are explanatory, our height, our group, and our source, for a total of 4 columns. And the sources are all 1. That's just because this is all from our first group. And then we're going to do the same thing with the second one, but have it be source equals 2. And we still have our in equals A here. So we see we are good there. And if you were wondering why we're running this, so remember we have 25 for the ID. We have 25 people for a height. So if we're running our group 4, we will run this. And we still have 25. Ooh, there we go. So we ran this again. So now we want to concatenate the 2 together again. So we're going to do that. We'll run. And they will be stacked on top of each other. And as you guys see, the higher IDs are at the top, and then once we get to 25, the IDs drop back down again. And we see that source 2 is on top, and then source 1 is on bottom. So I'm going to want it to be the other way around, just based on personal preference. So I will just switch the order I put these two in. So now our group height will be first, and then group 2 height will be second. So running this, I now start with a lower ID and a sources of 1, and our ID continues upwards. And then I get to the higher ID with source 2. Now you could, of course, just sort by that, but if you could put them in this way, that would work. And that's just a personal preference of mine. And then let's see our frequency and group by source. That means we are grouping, that means a group cross source right here. This is the cross table that we were asked to do. So we'll have group on one axis and source on the other. And this way, this is kind of like our 120A marginal and conditional PDFs that we had to look into to calculate our, of course, probabilities along that line. So we'll have source and then group on one axis, and then the bottom will be total of the columns will be total. And this will also, and then we'll have another one here, which will have our total here too. So that is what this table will create. And we could also, of course, created the tables like we did earlier, but that is what this cross the asterisk here does. It's a multiplication, so we're running this. And you guys can see it still has frequency percent, row percent, and column percent. So it's different than before, because remember we had the frequencies, so we'll run the ones up at the top one more time. So we had cumulative frequency and cumulative percent instead of row frequency. So we had two frequencies and 2%, but when you're using the cross table, we have frequency percent, row percent, and then column percent. So there's a slight difference. And then, of course, we can see everything here. The amount of observations that belong in each group from each source. And then, of course, the percent. And we could use this, of course, to do our cumulatives, our conditionals, PDFs, like I was talking about. So that is all I have for today. Thank you guys for watching the video. And if you have any questions, please let me know.